Hello and welcome to this Hangout for the World Economic Forum 2013. I'm Mike Oreskes, Senior Managing Editor of the Associated Press. And I'm joined today by Tim Brown, Master of Design Thinking and CEO of IDEO, which is a global design company which, as it says, it has a human-centered approach. And we'll come back in a second to talk about that. Welcome, Tim. Also joining us from around the world, we have some of the World Economic Forum's global shapers. These are young thinkers and entrepreneurs who are under the age of 30, something we both look back fondly to and remember. So, Tim, tell me a little bit about your firm and the work you're doing.
So what we're trying to do at IDEO is use something we call design thinking and a design approach to solve interesting challenges. And those challenges can be kind of anything. We started off being focused on technology. We worked on the first mouse for Steve Jobs for the Macintosh, for instance. We did the first laptop. Nowadays, we're designing everything from education systems to solutions for healthcare, to new medical devices, to consumer products. Anything that's new, interesting, that's going to get out into the world and have an impact. So we have an interesting mix of people. We have people with sort of entrepreneurial business backgrounds. We have designers. We have engineers. We have psychologists. We have practicing physicians who work on our medical projects. A really eclectic crowd of people, working on stuff that we find interesting.
Now, just before we sat down in this hangout, we were chatting, and you said something very interesting, which is, of course, everybody these days is fascinated by and interested in and wants to be part of innovation. And one of the things you mentioned was that there's a lot of innovation in innovation. Just tell us a little bit about that.
There's a lot of entrepreneurialism in innovation. And in a sense, entrepreneurialism is having an impact on how we innovate. Right. So, today we're seeing these really interesting software entrepreneurs finding new ways to develop software using these kind of lean, agile software development techniques, where you do a piece of software in 2 weeks and put it out there and learn, and those approaches are beginning to find their way back into how we work on innovation for something like a motor car or a product. We're trying to do things much faster. We're trying to, instead of taking a year to get that first prototype built and then go try it out, we're trying to get something done in 2 weeks. And this idea of iterative learning, that in fact the only way we figure out whether an idea is right or not is once you got it out there and you've got people using it. So yeah, so in a sense we are innovating how we do innovation, and entrepreneurs are helping us do that.
So as I said, the exciting part of our program is that we have 5 global shapers from around the world. So we're going to take a quick tour around the world. We've asked each of them to prepare a question for you, Tim. And so let's start with Dominic Llewellyn from London. He's a social entrepreneur, and he's the managing director of Achieve Good, Numbers for Good. Dominic, what's your question for Tim?
Hi, thanks for having me. Key question for me is, a number of global shapers, each hub has to set up what is in effect a mini social enterprise, and I've been really interested in what IDEO are doing in terms of IDEO.org, etc. What are the key kind of design thinking thoughts that you've got in terms of social innovation at present?
Sure. Hi, Dominic. Thanks. Yeah, we've been quite interested for quite a long time in how we use our skills to have social impact as well as business impact, and so we've been running a series of experiments for quite a number of years now, and they sort of culminated recently in us creating a not-for-profit version of IDEO. We kind of cloned IDEO to make a not-for-profit version in order to focus entirely on projects for the poor around the world. And there are a few things we found. The most important thing, and in fact, the thing that's the biggest release from working in the private sector, is that we can be completely transparent and public about everything we do, which means we learn faster and everybody learns faster. So one of the problems in the social sector is there's just not enough of us doing creative things. I think the number's probably something like 10,000 to 1. Innovators working in the business world versus innovators working in the social world. And so those of us who are doing it, we need to learn from each other as effectively as possible. So we decided right from the start that every project we were doing is public from the beginning. We blog, put on our website every step we make, every mistake we make, everything we learn, in the hope that learning will be useful to other people, so that we learn from the process as well as the outcome. So I think that's probably the single most important thing. We're also learning how to work on these things really fast and really efficiently, because there just aren't enough funds also available to work on many of these projects. Yeah. So that's actually teaching us some things that were actually quite useful to go work in some of our business projects as well. So it's an incredibly rich learning opportunity for us, as well as an opportunity to do important work.
Great.
Next, we have Christopher Geary, who's in Hong Kong. He's the COO of Asianet Group. Christopher, are you with us?
Yes, right here.
Please go ahead with your question for Tim.
Sure. My question for Tim was very much around how you match your product people and your business people when you're looking at innovating, because you'd mentioned about that a lot of innovation is about people and business entrepreneurship, and quite often when if we look at investments, we see a person with a great product, but they might not necessarily have the right business contract or the right entrepreneur that they would connect with. How do you see how do you see the best marriage between the product guy and the business guy?
Hi, Chris. Thanks. We're probably looking at that business question slightly differently from you. I would actually argue that there are two kinds of business people you actually need in order to be successful when it comes to innovation. You need the creative business input. In other words, you need to be able to be as creative with the business model as you are often with the product or the service, whatever it is that you're kind of actually tangibly doing for people. And then you need the operating bit of the business. And there's no doubt that for any sort of entrepreneurial activity to be successful, you need people who know how to scale and operate and make reasonably efficient and effective whatever idea it is that you're trying to execute. In general, we rely mostly on our partners to do that, either the startups we're working with or our clients. Where we focus most of our effort is looking for that creative business talent that can help imagine what those what those business models and business propositions might be that go alongside the idea for the product itself. So, in fact, as far as that's concerned, we're looking for people who exhibit many of the same characteristics as a designer or a creative engineer might have. They're curious, they want to explore things, they're collaborative, they're often very good at experimenting. They just happen to have business skills and business backgrounds. Often they've been entrepreneurs themselves, in fact, rather than the skills of an engineer or the skills of a designer. So we go out looking for those folks. We actually have to trawl. It's not that easy to find creative business people in the world because, to be really frank with you, most business schools are not designed to develop creative business people. They're designed to create business operators. But where we find them, we put them on. We make them kind of an integral part of the project team.
Well, great. Let's go next to Lima, Peru, and to Irene Huffmeyer, who is the founder of Life Out of Plastic, which is a great name, which turns plastic bottles into fashionable products, including handbags. You make anything that Tim and I would use?
We're looking into making more man-friendly bags. That's been something that's pointed out. We think it's unisex, but according to the male population, it's not unisex.
We're older. All right, your question for Tim.
Yeah, so my question links back to Dominic's question about social business. So at the end of the day, our mission is to raise awareness about this issue, which is plastic pollution. And we always have a very hard time drawing the line between our products and our business and our social impact. And so my question is, how can you effectively measure your impact, both economically and socially?
Well, hi Irene. That is, I'd say that's a subject that there's an awful lot of us working on right now. And I'd have to be really honest and say I don't think anybody has yet got as clean and clear a mechanism for measuring social impact as we have for measuring financial impact. Unfortunately, it's far too easy to measure financial progress, and it's quite difficult to measure social impact. But there are some people with some good ideas. I don't know if you know about the Acumen Fund in New York. They're a social investing, patient capital investment fund that is working very hard, has been working hard for quite a long time, looking at how to measure the social return on their investments rather than just the economic return on their investments. They've got some quite good ideas that they're talking about. For us, we have a number of things that that we can at least use as sort of input measures, if you like. I mean, one of them is if you don't get something out into the world, then it's not going to have any impact. So the first thing we want to measure is, did we do some work and did we get something out into the world so people are actually using it, and how many people are using it? So that's rather crude, but it's the kind of the first the first step, and then I think it tends to be very specific, case by case, depending on what the topic is. If you're designing a new school system, then it's not too hard to measure the outcomes, right? How many kids are going through that school system? How well are they doing, either against standards or whatever other means you have of testing? How well are they doing in that educational experience? That's relatively easy for you. Where you might be interested in economic growth or things that are affecting people downstream. It can be a little tricky, but I think you've actually got to design an impact measurement approach fairly specifically for whatever for whatever business, if you like, that you're building. I to be honest, have not seen yet very many generic approaches that look awfully useful.
We still have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to ask a couple of questions, but I also want to say to the global shapers that if you've got a second question, let me just mention something, and then we'll come back to you.
We still have Lena to go. Yeah.
And we still have Lena in Tunis, so we're going to do that. But let's do that before we do anything else. So Lamia Hatira in Tunis, let's hear your question.
Hi. My question is a little more related to our democratic transition at the moment. And so I guess my question is, what do you think the best way is to move a culture from a negative competition to constructive competition through innovation?
Wow, Lamia, that's an important question. And I'd love to think that innovation can be a sort of one of the means through which you can transform a society. I think I don't know that we've ever seen evidence of where that's happened, and I would love to see that happen. There's no doubt that a prerequisite for a kind of critical mass of innovation is optimism. I mean, you can't think about the future. You cannot. If you think the future isn't going to happen, it's hard to think about it, right? If you think, if you're worried about the downsides of everything, it's very hard to imagine new possibilities. And so a prerequisite of an innovation movement or culture, if you like, is optimism. So the question is, can you use the innovation to drive that optimism in the first place? And I guess if you were going to do that, you'd have to create very tight feedback loops between whatever innovation starts to happen, that grassroots innovation that might start at the beginning, and how that kind of gets out into society, and you sort of learn from it. So I think going back to the point I made right at the beginning, focusing innovation on things that can be very public. So focusing innovation on social issues, perhaps, rather than on private sector innovation that, for IP reasons, people want to keep secret, might be one of the tricks to having innovation have an impact faster. Because you can share it, you can be public about it, you can ask people if they see an interesting idea that's developed in one part of the country, somewhere in somebody in some other part of the country ought to be able to just take that idea and implement it. And so that might be the first thing to do, is like pick the sectors that you want to focus on. Is it education? Is it health? Is it is it governance? I mean, whatever those things might be that you think you can be, that will have social benefit and that you can be public about, that's what I would focus on.
Lami, it's interesting to remember that democracy itself was an enormous innovation when it was first created. Before the American and French revolutions, virtually no one believed that large groups of people on the scale of a country or a continent even now, could govern themselves without some outside authority, a king or God, overseeing the whole thing. And what the Americans, in a certain constitutional way, and the French in a kind of different way, invented was a system of self-government. It was radical and completely new when they did it. There really had never been anything like it before. So it has been done, and that means it can be done again, at least in my book. But the real issue now is, in a wildly different world from the ones that the founders of the United States and France started with. They lived in a world where information moved at the speed of sail and horseback, and we live in a world where information moves at the speed of light. But it's still the same problem. How do you govern yourself?
I'd also be tempted to drive your innovation as far down in terms of age as you can. I mean, there's one. start working. Can you start with innovation in schools, for instance? Excuse me. Can you have can you find ways of getting really more young people involved in innovating? They're somewhat less skeptical, somewhat more open. They've got more to be innovative about. They've got more to be optimistic about, one would hope. So I would pick topics that are going to be of interest to younger people. So one, I know that in America and in Europe, one of those topics has often been things like global warming, things like the environment, where children can get quite excited about those kinds of things quite easily, and they can find quite simple solutions. And so start kind of practicing this act of innovation with young people.
So let me ask a question. Your firm is, and I'll talk slowly so you can have a little water while we do. Your firm's based out in San Francisco, hard by Silicon Valley, and just before we sat down, you made an observation about the word entrepreneurship and how the definition of entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley is rather different from the definition you have of it. Tell us about that.
Well, I think it's awfully easy for us to assume entrepreneurship means I'm doing something that's funded by a venture capitalist. And entrepreneurship's been around a heck of a lot longer than that. VC-funded entrepreneurialism is one form of entrepreneurialism. But to be honest, in my opinion, getting anything new out into the world is being entrepreneurial. So an artist that has a really new creative idea that's very difficult to achieve is being an entrepreneur. And somebody in a large organization that sort of has to battle the organization to get a new idea out is being an entrepreneur. I think entrepreneurialism is a sort of it's almost like the hemoglobin of innovation. It's required everywhere. It has to go around the whole circulatory system. So whether it's large corporations, whether it's academia, whether it's startups, entrepreneurialism is an essential for innovation.
So let me come back to our global shapers. Can I get another question from out there around the world?
Hi, it's Dom from London. Obviously, you've been talking about it a bit this week in Davos. Really interested to get your thoughts, Tim, on the need to innovate in terms of the global economy. What in your view needs to happen in terms of redesigning the banks, redesigning capital markets, etc.?
Well, as I think about it, I'm no expert on capital markets and banks. I think there's a certain amount of back to basics that the banks might do, which is thinking about themselves as service businesses, which is essentially what they are, not machines. I think we spent a lot of time thinking of banks in the last few decades as machines to make money. I think we might get some benefit if we went back to thinking about banks as a service to society and a service to people, which is what they were invented to be in the first place.
Yeah.
And then start to figure out actually how to deliver more useful financial services to the people that they're supposed to be serving. So that might be a start. And in fact, I think generally, my observation, probably since the last big downturn, is that that most of the problems that seem most important today for us to tackle are actually fairly fundamental. They're sort of basic things. I mean, when I first started being a designer and the sorts of things I was fascinated with, new technology, the emergence of the digital world, in some ways, although they were hugely transforming, they were also quite esoteric in a sense. They were things that were available to a very small number of people, eventually became available to a lot of people. But I think the most important things for us to focus on today are actually things that are affecting everybody. So as I mentioned before, things like education, which is the education system in most places is unsustainable at the moment. Health, we know the health system in most countries is unsustainable. You mentioned financial services. These are the kinds of global warming is another one. Climate change. I mean, these are all extremely fundamental issues. They're also extremely complex and extremely systemic, and so they require lots of people tackling them in lots of different ways. But I actually think they're the most interesting things to spend our time on. And where all this new kind of exciting new technology comes in is in the aid of solving these kinds of big systemic problems, I think. And so that's what I'm spending more of my time on, and we're spending much more of our time on in my organization, is trying to find the right bits of those systemic problems to try and help out with.
I was interested in what you said before about how your organization works. You described what seemed like essentially an open source approach, where you basically put everything out there. Is that being followed widely by people in bigger companies and other organizations?
Well, there's more and more evidence, more and more examples of open innovation. Now, it's more difficult when you're talking about things that you want to try and protect the IP of. Mm-hmm. So mostly the way that's gotten done today is by having kind of prize-based systems. I mean, you might have heard of the X Prize, mm-hmm. Where people are basically competing to win a prize, but they're not actually collaborating with each other. You know, an individual or a team might be working on a solution to try and win the prize, but the 2 or 3 teams that might be, or 20 teams that are trying to collaborate, trying to compete for that prize, are not actually collaborating. When it comes to subjects where you might not have those same IP issues, like social issues, then you can actually get people collaborating. And so we actually have a platform that we use, something we call Open IDEO, which is an innovation platform for tackling social challenges. We have 40,000 people around the world working together on projects around illegal detention, youth unemployment, sanitation in the developing world, all kinds of subjects. And it's extremely successful at getting people to build off each other's ideas and contribute to each other's concepts. So you can do it as long as you don't worry about the IP.
Is there ever a too big? Do you ever get too big? And
well, yeah, I mean, well, it's less about whether you get too big as it's about ensuring that you're doing all the right things to constantly raise the quality of the contribution. But the fact is, you never know where the good ideas are going to come from. You know, we were working on a challenge in Australia a couple of years ago around food systems, and the best ideas came from a guy who lived in Latvia, who basically, as far as I could tell, surfed for a living. And he had some really interesting ideas about how you used to think about food. Well, you know, you would never normally have gone to think about, oh, I'll go and ask that guy in Latvia to work on my project. Never would have occurred to us. But because we had an open system, he was able to contribute.
Wouldn't have even occurred to me that there was a lot of surfing in Latvia.
I wouldn't have thought so either, but there you go.
So who else has a question, speaking of good ideas from anywhere?
Yeah, I'd like to ask another question.
Yes.
How might you get the private sector, I don't know, through innovative projects or through your own consulting to be more socially responsible? So, you know, if they have a CSR department, how might you work with them to contribute more to their social problems?
I'm not a big believer in CSR departments being the right way to get large companies to engage with these issues. In my opinion, one of the things I love about being here in Davos is that the smarter CEOs already understand that these kinds of issues are fundamentally affecting and will affect their ability to do whatever business they have. In some cases, some of these issues are actually constricting their ability to do business. In some cases, there are opportunities for them to do business. And so more and more of them are realizing that actually they have to find ways of weaving it sort of centrally into what they do. And you know, there are some large organizations that I think are showing a lead. I think Coca-Cola around the way that they use water. Unilever is doing some interesting things, and Nike has for quite some years has been really bringing some of these issues centrally into the way they think about their business. It's not done as a separate CSR activity. So for me, that's if you like, that's the movement that I want to try and encourage, is the movement to have, you know, large-scale private business realize that contributing to how we solve for agriculture in the future, or how we solve for clean water access. These are problems that they should be thinking about and applying their R&D resources to, and their imagination and their capital to, just as much as they might be applying them to building a new factory.
Do I have another question from our global shapers?
Tim, I had a question again going back to education. The systems we have in Hong Kong are heavily test-driven, and I know when we look at the way some of the, call it the best regarded or the most highly regarded companies in the world, a lot of them they're sifting on grade point averages on an archaic education system. Are there any ways that you at IDEO you've seen kind of ways, or how do you see education changing with, because even in technology we're still educating by rote, we're still educating on the same principles, just using technology to educate an old system.
Well, I mean, philosophically, Christopher, I believe that in a world that's getting ever more volatile, we'll need ever more creativity in order to solve this sort of changing world around us. And that, you know, the theme here this week is this idea of resilience. And one of the mechanisms for resilience, in my opinion, is creativity. So philosophically, it seems hard to argue that against needing more of it. How you do that successfully in education is tricky. I mean, partly because of the demanding needs and attentions that we have on education. I absolutely believe we've got to create space within the education system, the K through 12 system and the university system, for people to explore what I would say their own creative confidence, their ability to solve problems creatively. And rote learning does not help you do that. And so it's a hard and slow process to convince school systems and governments that this is important and necessary. We're beginning to find more and more of them that want to listen to that story. We're finding it somewhat in the US, although the US is problematic because it's so decentralized in terms of education. But we're certainly finding it in Europe, and we're finding it in the Far East. I mean, Singapore, for instance, which is another place that's had a reputation for highly kind of test-driven education, is getting very interested in the idea of introducing design thinking into education. So I'm hopeful, but it's going to be a long process.
And what about, in addition to what we always think of as education, young people, what about all the millions of people whose lives are being changed by workplace disruption?
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, the idea of, can businesses educate their own people to be more creative? Yeah, exactly. Is that a way of helping retrain people? So instead of only retraining around specific skills, but can we also retrain people to have more kind of creative confidence so that they can go and sort of design their own future, including in some cases becoming entrepreneurs, which is not about, which is one response to not having a job anymore, right?
And not a bad place to finish our first World Economic Forum Hangout. Tim Brown, thank you very much for being with us. Thanks to the Global Shapers who've been with us today. And thanks to all of you for joining us at this Hangout at the World Economic Forum. I'm Mike Oreskes.